Intersections, conversations. Frustrated, angered, confused, or just plain tired of the polarizing conversations about race? Not sure what to say, what to think, or even what to do? Well, you've come to the right place. As we move beyond the rhetoric to look for solutions that reduce health disparities and create better working environments. As my grandmother would say, it has to come up to come out. Welcome to our Intersections Conversations, where diversity, equity, and inclusion meet.
Hey everyone, ready to dig into something really relevant today. We're talking microaggressions, those subtle things that can trip us up, especially at work.
Yeah, those moments can be tough to navigate.
Our listeners want to find constructive ways to handle them, though. It's like walking a tightrope.
It totally is. And that's where this idea of restorative justice can be surprisingly helpful.
Okay, hold on. I'm picturing peace circles breaking out after every awkward coffee break. Not quite what I had in mind for the workplace.
No, not exactly. Let me explain. Restorative justice is less about punishment and more about repairing the harm and actually strengthening relationships. It's about understanding, taking responsibility, and finding a healthier way forward together.
Okay, so instead of just pointing fingers and saying, you messed up, it's more about creating a space for dialogue and getting everyone on the same page.
You've got it. And a key part of that is recognizing the different people involved. You've got the impacted party, the person who is on the receiving end of the microaggression.
Makes sense.
Then there's the initiating party, and that's the person who caused the harm, even if they didn't mean to. And let's not forget the community of care, which in a workplace could be HR, your manager, or even the overall team dynamic.
Right, everyone plays a role. I like the shift away from terms like victim and offender. It feels less like a courtroom and more about genuinely trying to address things.
It makes a huge difference. That language shift changes the tone immediately. It moves away from blame and towards understanding and finding solutions. But here's where it gets even more complex power dynamics at work.
Oh, absolutely. It makes a big difference if your boss suggests something versus a coworker, even if they're saying the exact same words.
Exactly. A manager's words, even well-intentioned ones, land differently simply because of their position.
And you mentioned something earlier that I want to unpack a bit, coercive motivation. That feels like a real minefield, especially for people in leadership roles.
Yeah, it's a big one and often overlooked. Leaders need to be so aware of how their position, even unconsciously, can create pressure.
What are some things they should watch out for?
Well, one common trap is this illusion of choice. Like, imagine a manager saying, taking on this new project would be amazing for your professional growth. On the surface, it sounds like a fantastic opportunity.
Right, but I can totally see how an employee might feel like they can't say no to that, you know? It's that unspoken pressure we were just talking about.
Exactly. So clear and open communication is really important in those situations. Instead, it might sound more like, we've got this new project coming up. Would you be interested in taking the lead, or would you prefer to be involved in a different way? It's all about offering genuine options, not ultimatums disguised as opportunities.
I see the difference. So we're talking about clear communication, being upfront about those power dynamics, and using language that encourages understanding. But what does it actually look like to create a workplace where healing and reconciliation are actually possible after a microaggression?
You're getting at the heart of this whole approach. I think the foundation is a safe space for both the impacted party and the initiating party to be able to talk openly and honestly.
So no fear of getting in trouble or being judged.
Exactly. Just a space for everyone to be vulnerable and real. And it's also crucial to acknowledge those power differences up front. Not ignore them, but actually address them. For example, the person in a leadership position could say something like, look, I know that as your manager, my words can carry extra weight, and I want to make sure you feel comfortable sharing your honest perspective.
It's a simple statement, but yeah, it can make a huge difference just by showing that awareness.
It levels the playing field a bit. And beyond creating that safe space, we need accountability.
What do you mean?
The initiating party has to own up to their actions and understand the impact. This isn't about public shaming or anything like that. It's about recognizing that regardless of their intent, what they said or did had a negative effect on someone else.
So it's less about figuring out who's right or wrong and more about understanding the effect and finding a way forward together.
Exactly. It's a whole different kind of conversation than what we're used to. And this is where having a neutral facilitator can be super helpful.
Someone who can kind of guide the conversation.
Yes, he could be someone from HR, a trained mediator, or even a respected colleague, but they're there to make sure everyone feels heard and respected.
That makes a lot of sense. Having that neutral party can really de-escalate things and keep everyone focused on moving forward. But let's talk about the nitty-gritty. What do those actual steps towards healing and reconciliation look like in a workplace?
Let's get practical. Imagine a manager unintentionally makes a comment in a team meeting that reinforces a harmful stereotype.
Okay, so we have our microaggression. What happens next?
The first hurdle is making sure the person impacted by that comment feels empowered to actually address it. That could look like talking to the manager directly, going to HR, or even just confiding in a trusted coworker.
So step one is really making sure that the person who was harmed feels safe and supported in actually speaking up.
That's the key. Then the focus shifts to facilitating a conversation between the impacted party and the initiating party, ideally with that neutral person we talked about.
Okay, and what does that conversation actually look like?
It's not about pointing fingers or blaming anyone. It's about understanding how the action impacted the other person and how to repair the harm that was done. For instance, maybe a manager constantly interrupts their female employees.
Right, I've seen that.
Well, through this type of conversation, they might realize that without meaning to, they're actually reinforcing a harmful stereotype about women in communication.
Yeah.
Having that aha moment can really change things.
It's not about punishment, it's about understanding and empathy.
Yes,
And it sounds like the goal is to move forward, not to dwell on the past.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where those real breakthroughs can happen. The initiating party might finally realize that their words had a different impact than they intended. And the impacted party, for the first time, might feel seen and heard, which is a huge step toward healing.
This is really interesting stuff. We've covered a lot, from those microaggressions we might not even notice to the power of restorative justice to actually heal harm and create a better work environment. It feels hopeful, honestly.
Me too.
I think it's a good time for us to hit pause and give our listeners a moment to process all of this because there's a lot to unpack. We've talked about how restorative justice can help in these situations, but how do we make sure it's not just a one-time conversation? How do we make real change in the workplace?
That's where the community of care comes in. Remember, this isn't just about two people hashing things out on their own. The workplace itself has to support this whole restorative approach.
So it's more like a cultural shift than a one-off conversation.
You got it. It's about building a culture where we don't just ignore microaggressions, but address them head on. That could mean having clear policies, training on things like unconscious bias, and making sure there are open lines of communication across the board. It's about making these principles part of the DNA of the workplace.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you have any examples of what that might look like in practice?
Sure. Imagine a company implements mandatory training for everyone on how to recognize and address microaggressions. But it's not just a boring slideshow.
We've all been there.
It goes deep into practical ways to interrupt microaggressions when they happen and gives people tools to have those important conversations in a constructive way.
So it's about giving everyone the tools to be part of the solution, not just stand by and watch.
Exactly. And it goes beyond training. Leaders need to really walk the walk, not just talk the talk. When leaders openly acknowledge the impact of microaggressions and demonstrate inclusive language and behavior, it sets a powerful example for the whole organization.
It's true. Actions speak louder than words. People pay attention to what their leaders do, not just what they say in an email.
Absolutely. And another practical step is to have safe and easy ways for people to report microaggressions.
Like what?
It could be an anonymous reporting system, or having dedicated HR folks trained to handle these situations sensitively, or even just fostering an environment where people feel comfortable going directly to their managers or coworkers.
Yeah.
It's about getting rid of those obstacles and showing people that these issues are taken seriously.
Right. Building trust is essential. If people don't feel safe speaking up, none of this will work.
You said it. The organization needs to show that it's committed to a safe and inclusive environment, and people need to feel like they can speak up without fear.
It's a two-way street for sure. This is resonating with me, though. It's not about finding someone to blame. It's about creating a culture where we are constantly learning and growing together. And those aha moments can lead to real positive change.
Exactly. When someone realizes that their words landed in a way they didn't intend, it can be a huge moment of personal growth. And that's something to celebrate.
It's like turning potentially negative situations into opportunities for learning and building a stronger, healthier environment. But before we move on, I want to come back to the manager's role in all of this. We've talked about the pitfalls, but what does it actually look like for a manager to use their position to genuinely empower their team in this context? What does getting it right actually look like for them?
Such a good question. It really comes down to fostering what we call psychological safety on the team. Remember, even when a manager has good intentions, their words can carry extra weight because of the power dynamic.
Right, it comes with the territory.
So it's about being aware of that dynamic and actively creating an environment where everyone feels like they can speak freely, share their thoughts, and even disagree without fear.
So it's not just about avoiding saying the wrong thing, but also about creating the space for others to be heard.
Exactly. There are some really practical things managers can do. First, be super clear that different viewpoints are valued and that they want to hear from everyone, not just the loudest voices in the room.
Right. Sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say.
It could mean doing things like directly asking for input from those quieter team members, or using a round-robin approach in meetings to make sure everyone has a chance to speak.
I like that. It's about being intentional and making sure everyone gets a chance to be heard. What else?
Another thing is for managers to be willing to be vulnerable themselves. Like if they make a mistake, if they say something that misses the mark, they need to own up to it.
We're all human.
Exactly. Apologize sincerely and show that you're right there with your team, learning and growing. It's powerful.
It shows that it's okay to make mistakes as long as we learn from them.
Exactly. And finally, it's important to celebrate those aha moments in others. When someone on your team shows growth or a shift in their perspective, acknowledge it and celebrate it. It reinforces this idea that we're all in this together, constantly learning and growing.
This has been so helpful. We've covered so much, from understanding those subtle microaggressions to the potential of restorative justice to heal and create more inclusive workplaces. It feels really hopeful.
It has been a great conversation.
Before we wrap up, I want to make sure we leave our listeners with some practical things they can do to start implementing these ideas in their own workplaces. It can feel overwhelming to think about changing a whole workplace culture, but it starts with each of us taking those small but important steps, right? It can feel overwhelming to think about changing a whole workplace culture. But what are some tangible things our listeners can do, starting today, to make a difference?
You're absolutely right. It starts with each of us. First and foremost, commit to educating yourself. There are so many resources available on microaggressions, unconscious bias, inclusive communication books, podcasts, articles, you name it. Don't wait for your company to implement a training program. Take the initiative.
That's a great point. You can be the one to spark change, even in small ways. You don't need a fancy title to make a difference.
Exactly. And here's another simple but powerful action practice: active listening. When a colleague shares an experience, especially if it involves a microaggression, listen with the intent to understand their perspective. Put aside any defensiveness and just be present with them.
Sometimes just feeling heard can make a world of difference. It's about validating their experience and showing empathy.
Absolutely. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak up. If you witness a microaggression, don't stay silent. You don't have to be confrontational about it. Sometimes a simple, hey, that didn't sit right with me, can disrupt the moment and open the door for more mindful conversation.
It's about having each other's backs and creating a culture where we feel empowered to address these behaviors, even when it feels a little uncomfortable.
And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. We're all learning and growing, and that includes messing up sometimes. Don't beat yourself up if you make a mistake. Be open to feedback, be willing to apologize, and commit to doing better next time.
It's about progress over perfection, which is a good reminder for all of us.
Couldn't agree more.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've explored the subtle dynamics of microaggressions, learned how to navigate those tricky power dynamics, and even uncovered the incredible potential of restorative justice to create more inclusive workplaces.
It's been a pleasure joining you on this deep dive. I'm so glad we could have this conversation.
And for our listeners, remember, creating a more inclusive world starts with each of us. Take those small but mighty steps, start those courageous conversations, and let's work towards building a better future together. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.
Intersections, conversations. Talk is cheap. We have explored key issues in developing better human relations, but it means nothing if you don't do something with our conversations. Race and differences are just obstacle illusions, so do something right where you are. Well, that's it for this intersection conversation, where diversity, equity, and inclusion meet.